Hello. I'm here with Professor David and the artist Chuck Feesago. And Chuck Feesago is an artist and an activist, and he is going to tell us about what that means in the art world and what it means in the cultural moment. I am Maxine Cap. I am a colleague of many years of both of these gentlemen and artists, and I would like them to share with you and me to join in on what we can do as artists. Artists are often thought of in a sort of vacuous way, that they don't have much influence on the culture, but actually absolutely everything that we touch, everything that we wear, most of the things that we read, there's very little that does not have the input of an artist. In fact, the input of the artist is so ubiquitous that it's almost entirely invisible. So when we talk to artists, we have to actually remember that they are chiefly authors of our culture. And what they do influences us in such a subtle way that as I said, it is almost invisible. So let's listen carefully to what the artists have to say. And maybe there's even just one nugget of enlightenment that we might glean from this. Let's go, shall we?
Well, I had a question for you, Chuck. You're talking about how you moved here with your family. You said how old were you?
Oh, well, let me give you a little bit on that one. I was actually born in California.
Okay.
And then we moved back east. My dad was in the military, so we moved back east to North Carolina and then Virginia. That's another story. That's some cultural crap going on there. Sorry for the English. And then when I was 10, we moved back here, back to California. And that was at the same time when all of a sudden the family from Samoa started coming in to the United States. So.
Okay. Well, I was wondering, so you were talking earlier about how you've been doing research on just the history and ceremonies, and do you find yourself being someone that is recently arrived to California that you can share with them and have this back and forth with their history and how it works here in California, and someone that people can go to as a Pacific Islander?
I actually don't limit myself just to California, because I'm also having conversations with people in New Zealand and Australia who are basically going through the same exact conversations.
Yeah.
So that's what has fueled a lot of my curiosity, because they start saying things in the process and start carrying on pieces of some sort, and they all basically produce something that is art related, but not necessarily strictly art related. It's more political for most of them, but they interact with artists of their communities, and they have actually lots of large, complex, what you would call organizations. I'm not quite sure how to call them, but it's almost like, they're in school with each other. They create their own little schools, and they stay with each other, and they keep on producing something along the way, whether it be spoken word, music, or some form of art or performance in the whole process. That doesn't happen here because most of the population of Pacific Islanders, number one, don't believe in art in general. They think it's a frivolous thing to do, and it's something you just do as a hobby. So trying to get them to gather is somewhat difficult. And also, whatever they do produce as art, they're not willing to do anything outside that. So when they look at my work, they don't see a lot of the stuff that I see and what I'm trying to carry out conversations with. So I'm not quite sure who I'm talking to except myself. But also I'm hoping that other people from other cultures can actually see what is going on and how what I do actually relates to what they're trying to do in the whole process. So I try not to limit myself just
Yeah.
to my own culture, but I'm trying, because technically speaking, I'm everybody's part of everybody's culture in one way or another.
Yeah.
And they're all part of my culture because, we're in Los Angeles.
Yeah. Well, your work doesn't speak to a community. It speaks internationally. It's part of a larger dialogue that fits into any art around the globe.
I hope so. I hope so because, I don't believe we should just be having one story, carrying on one conversation. I think we need to keep on talking to everybody about everything and keep on going with that communication in some way, one way or the other.
I had a friend who was a Chilean artist, and what his friends and people thought he should be making was not what he wanted to make. He wanted to speak to the world. He didn't want to make paintings of villages and stuff. He wanted to make big international, mind-blowing, installations and projects.
This happens with everybody, and I'm sure Mask has heard the same thing. You don't make Pacific Island work. And I said, well, I do because I'm Pacific Islander, but just because it doesn't look like the stereotype stuff you want us to have or produce for your comfort doesn't mean that it's not Pacific Island.
Yeah.
So it's like,
Yes, that's odd because I was just thinking about some of the students that I've had from India who, although their work has nothing to do with the culture that was basically had hegemony over their continent for so many years, the British, there are little bits of Britishisms that popped up in their handwriting, in their speech. And I was wondering if there were some things that were so culturally ingrained, either if they were impressed upon Samoan or that they had to do with the U.S. Armed Services as you be in the South, or any of these other things that might have little flecks, the little sort of grace notes that sneak into your work. Are there any things like that that happen in the work that you currently do?
That's interesting. I'm looking at the piece that's behind you. My dad was a Marine. He was a hard Marine. So everything had to be perfect. And everything had to be in its place, but, just a whole series of things. And when I first started practicing art, that's the way my art was trying to be. I was never satisfied with that whole process. So I actually went way over to the other side where I try to make my work look as messy, but as organic and as logical as possible, because I want you to see inside my head the reality that I see in the process. So in a sense, it's kind of like the opposite. Now I understand why the Marines are so enchanting for some Samoans or some Pacific Islanders, because one, it's the one option for them to get off the island. But also the structure of Samoan culture or Pacific Island culture, the family structure, actually trains you to be a Marine in some sense. The best way I could describe it. There's a certain kind of hierarchy that you follow through. You have your generals, you have your lieutenants, and you have your privates. And, basically you have to do certain things to make things happen, and that's how you work your way up to the ranks. Now, if I had followed through with that, this is where I have a lot of conflict with my Pacific Island families. I think way too independent from the rest of them. And they don't see me as necessarily as a team player. Because one thing, I can't stand being around that many people all the time. And we're talking about in a 3-bedroom house, having 40 or 50 people living in that house. That drives me nuts. So I'm also very private about this. So there's some things I just can't get over because in a sense I'm spoiled. I have to admit to that, I'm spoiled. kind of a thing. But I understand, and I love it when dip my toe into the family situation and see all the happening and see how everybody interacts. And, I understand why they do what they do because of their position within the family. But it just is not in me. Unfortunately, my mom has inbred too much of her side of the family into me to try to play along with my dad's side easily. So, but I still love it. It's one of those love-hate relationships. So
It's a big
that's a
family.
great question, Max.
So Max, as the curator of the exhibition, what was your thought process in bringing in Chuck and his work to this virtual exhibition?
Well, bringing Chuck into the work was actually Chuck was one of the first people I thought about when we were talking about the way that there is a sort of our current moment, the issues of politics, of elections, brutality, of protest, everything that was happening right now. One of the people that I wanted to initially was Chuck, because Chuck and I have been friends for almost 10 years now. And I knew him as a man who had experienced a variety of cultural shifts. And I wanted to get his point of view on what was happening at this moment. As an artist, and as I was saying, that how the sort of subtle influence that artists have on our culture, I wanted to see what sort of insights that he might make, even though Chuck's background and my background differ greatly, although there is a military aspect to a portion of my background, but nothing like Chuck's. I went to a military school for 10 years when I was a child. But my oldest brother was but very much older, was a Vietnam War hero, Bronze Star, Silver Star, that sort of war hero. So that idea of conflict and the idea of patriotism and participation in a culture that may not be the most welcoming culture for you, in a place where one must make a sort of mark for oneself, and sort of a piecemeal building of one's own character and notion of what it means to be an American and what it means to be a cultural citizen and a cultural contributor. So Chuck was absolutely one of the first people I thought of in that way, that he could make a contribution from varied experiences.
Great.
Well, something I should share at the same time too. My family, in a sense, became part of the Black community only as a means of refuge. It occurred, I actually have adopted Black parents, which I wish I could find them, but my adopted parents are Black, and my godparents are Native American. So my aspect of culture, sort of like I was raised in a situation. Oh, and I should add one more thing. When we lived in Virginia, because it was an anti-miscegenation state, the military put us in a neighborhood. They bought a whole neighborhood in northern Virginia, and put all the mixed marriage military people in that complex. So everybody in the neighborhood were married to a white and some other nationality. I thought that was the norm. I grew up with thinking that was the norm. It wasn't until, and the reason why we left, and the reason why we moved to California is because they, technically speaking, they shipped everybody in that neighborhood out just before the March on Washington. in the 60s. So in a sense, the military had a lot to do with how I ended up growing up and understanding the world, or what I believe to be that certain kind of thing of the world going on. But with going back to the original concept, we always looked at ourselves as being more closely related to the Black community, only because the Black community is more accepting to us than any other community at the time. So it was sort of our safe haven at that point, because there were a lot of things that we had to go through. And I would have to say, because my dad was extremely dark and could easily have been taken as being Black himself, and had gone through a lot. I mean, I witnessed him being beaten up. I witnessed ourselves being threatened with bodily harm. And I had this one horrific thing that happened, not me, but to him, while we were across country one summer, where a couple of white guys took a gas pump, poured gas all over him, and threatened to set him on fire. And it was one of those memories. I had the hardest time when they started doing self-service gas pumps. I had the hardest time dealing with that whole issue, because every time I smelled gas, I was taken back to that place every time. So, and then there was also a time when our family, my mom and my sister and I, got caught up in the Watts riots. We were in the middle, because our family lived, one of our family members lived in the Watts area. And we happened to be there at the time when it happened. So that was my first experience of that mass violence in the process. Now, interestingly enough, and this is one of the things that happens for a lot of people, you think everything is normal when you're growing up. And then when you finally get out of the house and go to the real world, start realizing everything in your life was not normal. It was just an extraordinary, rapid situation that you were in, and you had to basically see what was going on. That's when I started really becoming more aware of my life and who I am and how my place in the world at that time. So I'm sorry, I'm a little choked up with the whole thing. But with that
Thank you.
said,
Thank you, Jay.
because that's something Max and I have not talked about. We have not talked about my background in that essence, and why I feel comfortable in some places and not comfortable in other places.
I think that's it's very interesting what you're saying, having grown up in that neighborhood in North Virginia, that was a world that was unlike really any other world outside of that bubble. And then the shock of stepping out of that, like, this isn't how it is. I mean, and I think the same thing for me in a much different fashion. I grew up in suburban Orange County. Now it's like, once you step out of the area, it's not the area that you grew up in, and it's
well, that's the whole thing. In Orange County, I grew up when it was all farmland.
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, I used to be able to ride my bike all the way through Orange County, all the way down to San Clemente. It was nothing. It was just rows and rows and rows and rows of trees, orange trees and stuff like that. It wasn't until I got out in the real world, I find out that how much my parents, especially my grandparents, protected me from the reality of what was going on. And surprisingly, they were some of the people that actually were politically oriented without really being involved, because they were involved with Brown versus Brown, fighting against the segregation in the whole process. And I really didn't know what that meant at that time, and really understand what was going on. But it's like, their activism, in some sense, sort of like skipped a generation, because my parents were like nothing as far as being politically oriented or socially active in any way. But yeah, I think that's where I got from the whole idea of just if it's not right, you got to do something
Yeah.
about the process.